And here we have a UI for weapons. By default, we only have a normal gun, which we can shoot, but we can't do anything else. If I then pick up a new weapon, it appears in my weapon slots UI, and now I can switch over using Q or E and shoot with this new weapon. I don't have a third weapon, so I can't go over. If I pick up a new weapon though, again it appears in my weapon slots, and now I can select it. Hi, I'm Ricky. If you haven't watched part 1 of this video tutorial, make sure you do now. You can also download the entire project for free from my GitHub, all links in the description. Alright, so let's start. I want to expand on the player's inventory by making a new script entirely for managing the player's weapons. Right now, inside our player, we only have one script called player shooting. Let's make another one called player inventory. I've also opened the player shooting script, and now I'm gonna divide the things I have to do with managing the player's inventory and put them in this new script. So I'm gonna take the weapons in possession, the weapon index, and the current weapon. On the other hand, in player shooting, I'm gonna add a reference to our player inventory. I'm also gonna take the selection of the current weapon on awake and put it here. And I'm also gonna take away the try switch weapon. And just as well, I'm gonna take it out of update and make a new update and put that function here. Finally, in try shoot and in shoot, we are taking the current weapon's value, but we don't have that anymore. So let's call our player inventory value and use that. And then we just have to go back to player inventory and make a current weapon public. But since we don't want to see this in the inspector, I'm also going to mark it as hide in the inspector. If we wanted to write better code, it would instead make this current weapon value a get private set property. But we're not going to see properties in this tutorial. Alright, back to player shooting. Let's also replace this. And we're good. Let's go back to Unity. I'm gonna drag in the player inventory value. And for the weapons in possession, I'm gonna put the default gun. This one right here. Now that we have a separate script entirely for managing the player's inventory, I want to add a way to add weapons to the player. I thought about doing this through a shop, but instead I'm gonna do this through manual drops in the game. If instead you wanna see how to add weapons to the game through a shop, then let me know. Although I already have a very extensive tutorial about shops, in that regard it was about 2D skins, but the process is 99% the same as you would apply it to weapons. So I'm gonna leave a link to that video in the description. Alright, in our case, let's instead make the weapons in our scene. So I'll make a new 2D object. And I've named it weapon drop. I'm gonna change the image to the second weapon's bullet. So this red bullet right here. And let's make and add a new component called weapon drop. In here, we want to detect when the player touches this weapon drop, and when it does, we add a weapon to the player. So first, let's make a variable for the actual weapon that I want to add. And to detect the player, we're going to use onTriggerEnter2D. To detect the player specifically, we're going to check its tag. And to actually add a weapon, we are going to do that through the player inventory. So for now, let's get the player inventory's value. And before we go any further, let's go back to player inventory and let's make a new public function called addWeapon. And as a parameter, it's going to require a weapon. We're going to want to do a couple of things in here. For now, let's just add the weapon to add to our weapon array. We can't currently do that because weapons in possession is an array and not a list. So let's change that real quick. And make sure you add the system collections generic library. Alright? And now we can add a weapon to our list. We also have to fix the semantics here because it is a list and not an array. Instead of .length, we now use .count. But that's about it. Alright, and now back to weapon drop, we can call addWeapon. and we use the value that we made here. And finally, we destroy the weapon drop. Alright, back to Unity. Let's assign a different weapon to the current one, to this weapon drop. Let's also add a collider to this weapon drop. Or else we won't be able to detect the player. And let's also set the collider to its trigger. Now to the player. We want to add a collider to him as well. I want him to be physical, not trigger. Now let's also add a rigid body to the player so we can actually move. And I'm also going to make some ground so that we don't fall over. And make sure you also add a collider to the ground. Now let's select the player, and let's add the player's tag. That's the tag we're looking for in our code. Finally, we just need a way to actually move our player. So inside the player, I'm going to add a new component, and that's going to be the player movement. If you already have a player movement script, you can skip this passage. In here, I'm going to make a very quick and placeholder type of player movement. What matters here is that we use the rigid body. Without a rigid body, it wouldn't be able to detect the collision with the weapon drop. This isn't the focus of the tutorial, this is just a very placeholder type of movement. And I'm also going to disable the rotation so that we don't fall over. And hit play. And now I can move left and right. I can also shoot with my normal gun, but if you see down below in my player inventory, I only have one weapon. If I press E or Q, nothing happens. If I touch the weapon drop disappears and it appears in my inventory. Now I can press E, shoot, and here's my new weapon. Perfect. Now I want to add some type of visual feedback so that it shows which kind of weapons we have without looking at the Unity inspector. And we're going to do this through UI. So let's go in our scene and let's make a new panel. And that's going to be our weapons panel. Make sure you always rename your objects. Now in the canvas, as always, let's set the scale mode to scale with screen size, and let's set the values to our current resolution, and set pixel perfect to true. Before we do more stuff in the hierarchy, I'm gonna add some game object dividers. Much better. Now in the weapons panel, I'm just gonna shrink it here, and change the anchors as well. And here I want to make so that every weapon has its own panel. So let's make another panel in here. And that's going to be a weapon slot. And shrink it down to say a third. And it doesn't matter if we change the anchors now, we're going to do that later. Now inside this weapon slot, let's make another panel. And that's going to be for the selection highlight. And then let's also make an image. And that's going to be the actual weapon's image. And I'm also going to change the anchor points to fill in the weapon slot. And the same goes for the selection highlight, although that's already been done automatically. Now by default, I'm going to disable the highlight, although the image, let's make it a bit smaller than its weapon slot. Alright, and now we can make a prefab out of this. And if we duplicate it, we can now select the weapons panel and we can add a horizontal layout group. If your weapon slots appear a bit funky, you can select Ctrl Child Size both on the width and the height, and they should appear correctly. Alright, and now we just need to change the weapon image to reflect which weapons we have in our inventory. I also want to turn on or turn off the highlight to show which weapon we are currently holding. To do so, let's select our weapon slot prefab, and let's make and add a new component called weapon slot UI. In here, we just want a reference to the highlight panel, that's going to be a game object, and a reference to the weapon's image, so an image. And make sure you add the unityengine.ui so that you can use the image class. Alright, and now in player inventory, let's add a reference to all the weapon slots that we have in the UI. So let's make an array of weapon slots UI. I've called it weapon slots in UI. We can already test this. For now, let's just change the element 0 of this array to reflect our current weapon's image. So we take this array, we take its element 0, and we select its image, and want to change the image sprite. Now for the actual sprite of the weapon, we could make a new value inside our scriptable object weapon and have a new sprite specifically for the weapon. In my case, I'm just going to use the sprite of the bullets prefab. So I'm going to take the element 0 of weapons in possession, take the bullet prefab, and I'm going to use getComponent sprite renderer to get the sprite of the bullet. Although again, ideally, you want a sprite specifically for the weapon, but of course, that's up to you. Now back to Unity, let's add a reference to the selection highlight and the weapon image. And now in our player, we now have this new array for weapon slots. I'm gonna lock the inspector, select the weapon slots, and add them to our array. And you can see that the element 0 corresponds to this weapon slot, which is the first in our panel. And now if we hit play, you can see that now the first element of the UI has our bullet's image. Alright, now when we add a new weapon, let's add the weapon's image to our inventory UI. That's gonna be quite simple. Let's take again our weapon slot array, and when we add a weapon, we want to know what is the index of the new weapon that we have, and change the image of the weapon slot correspondingly. That's gonna be quite simple. Let's call our array. And because the weapon is always going to be added at the end of a list, that means that if our list has 2 elements, then we want to take the second element of our slots UI. That's going to be element 1. So we just take all weapons in possession.count -1. And then we select its weapon image. And again, we set its sprite to the bullets prefab. And to get the bullet prefab, we use weapon to add. Alright, back to Unity, hit play, and when I collect the weapon, you see it adds correctly to the second slot. Alright, and final feature, we made these selection highlight game objects, now let's also use them. By default, we want to turn on the element 0 of our list in the UI, so let's do that again in player inventory. In here, let's take the element 0 of weapon slots in UI, call its highlight game object, and just set it to true. You can see that it has worked, the selection highlight game object is turned on, but it doesn't really make a difference. So let's open the prefab. I'm going to turn on the highlight momentarily, and I'm going to crank up the color all the way up. That should be a bit more visible. Let's try that again. It's a bit better now, but we can of course always change this in the future. Now we need to deactivate the currently highlighted panel and activate the one of our corresponding new weapon. So when we try to switch weapon, before we update our current weapon index, let's call again our weapons.ui array. And for the index, we use our current weapon index. We take the highlight panel and set it to false. And then we do the exact same thing, but instead of current weapon index, we use the weapon index to go to. And instead of false, we set it to true. And to make a better test, I'm going to make a new weapon drop. So I'm just going to duplicate this, move it a bit, change the image, and change the weapon to add to the player. And that's it, here's our new weapon drop. Let's hit play, and here we are, we have a UI for our weapons. By default we only have a normal gun, which we can shoot, but we can't do anything else. If I then pick up a new weapon, it appears in my weapon slots UI, and now I can switch over using Q or E, and shoot with this new weapon. I don't have a third weapon, so I can't go over. If I pick up a new weapon though, again it appears in my weapon slots, and now I can select it. If I change the order in which I pick up the weapons, they appear differently as well in my UI. Alright, so that's it for this video, hope you learned something new. If you have any doubt or any suggestion you'd like to know, do tell me in the comments. Like I said before, if you want to see a specific video just to adding weapons through a shop instead of through weapon drops like I did here, do let me know. Make sure to subscribe so you know what's coming up next. And you can also follow me on Twitter so you always know which projects I'm working on. Right now I'm also developing a new game for PC. It's called AAA. There's a teaser trailer and a gameplay video, all links in the description. And remember, you can always download my newest projects for free from Github. And you can also join my Discord channel if you need some help with programming. Alright, but that's it. See you next time.